From the Oregon State University's Extension Service, you are listening to In the Woods with the Forestry and Natural Resources Program. This podcast aims to show the voices of researchers, land managers, and members of the public interested in telling the story of how woodlands provide more than just trees, they provide interconnectedness that is essential to your daily life. Stick around to discover a new topic related to forests on each episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to In the Woods podcast, presented by the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Program at Oregon State University. I'm your host, Carrie Berger, and while I'm not new to Extension, I am Extension's new fire program manager. This month's episode is going to cover fire. We'll talk about the very basics of fire, how it's used, and its benefits. And with me today, I have David G. Lewis and Amanda Rao. David is an instructor at OSU in Anthropology and Ethnic Studies and a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. And Amanda is the new Regional Fire Specialist for the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Fire Program. Amanda serves counties in the Willamette Valley and North Cascades. Welcome, David and Amanda. Would you like to give a brief introduction of yourself and the work that you do?
Yes, Carrie. I'm an instructor in anthropology and ethnic studies. I've been a teacher for about 3.5 years at OSU, but I've taught at most colleges throughout Western Oregon. And I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, a descendant of the Santiam, Takelma, and Chinook peoples, and I've been studying Native peoples for about 25 years, and I generally will sort of research the sort of colonial history of the tribes and write up essays I put on my blog site, which I call the Cortex Journal, which is at Indian History Research. And these essays become part of my curriculum for my classes. So I really enjoy this work because I'm revealing the history of our past, which has not been well written.
Wonderful. Amanda.
Thanks, Carrie. I had the fortune of starting my fire career right around the same time that I was finishing up my philosophy degree at the University of Oregon. And I say that's fortunate because even though it doesn't seem like a natural fit, my philosophy degree and studies in that discipline were actually what originally attracted me to fire. But as I started working with the elements and becoming a student of fire, I realized that I needed to understand it from a different perspective. So I returned to school to do my post-bac at Oregon State in natural resources, and then completed a master's in natural resources with a fire ecology and management emphasis at the University of Idaho. Throughout that time, I worked actively in both fire suppression and prescribed fire management, but I've ultimately focused my work on prescribed fire. I worked with the U.S. Forest Service for the majority of my career, but I made a transition to work for the Nature Conservancy about 6 years ago and managed their fire program in Oregon and Washington, focusing a lot on prescribed fire implementation. And then recently I accepted this position that I am currently in, where I have the opportunity to share the work that I've done with others and help educate folks about the value of prescribed fire and the work that fire does on the landscape overall.
Great. So Amanda, can you tell us, what is fire?
Fire is by definition combustion or burning. It's a process by which substances combine chemically with oxygen from the air to give out bright light, heat, and smoke. But in the woods, fire is a natural and necessary disturbance process that creates habitat for wildlife, rejuvenates vegetation, cultivates and maintains cultural resources, and plays an important role in both forest and rangeland health.
So actually, let's dive a little bit deeper into that. And David, can you start off and tell us, how is fire used?
Yeah, the tribes used fire for thousands of years. I think archaeologically, there's a record of 8,000 years in the Willamette Valley. But fire was used as a tool by the tribes, really for various purposes. One of which is to sort of keep down the overgrowth in the valley. That we know that with the great soil, great sunlight, great conditions, that we get way too much plant growth, and so if we let it go, it becomes a huge bramble. So fire is a very efficient way to sort of knock all that stuff down every year. The tribes would set up the fire normally in the fall, in like late September, early October, when the rains first started to fall, and that was a safe time period where you wouldn't get a catastrophic burn. You would just get what they call a cool burn, which is a cool burn across the landscape, and then clean up all of the last year's debris, woody debris, and so that would serve various purposes for tribes. It would clear sight lines. They could see across the valley. They could see their game, if they needed to be hunting. They could walk across the valley because, too much bramble makes it impossible to walk. They could use fire. Some stories say they use fire to perhaps herd deer and elk into hunters. So that's one purpose. And then there's secondary effects as well. Scholars have thought that perhaps the fire kept down on the pests, insects and other pests that could overtake a landscape and make it almost inhabitable sometimes. And also it discourages plants that the tribes didn't want in the valley, that were not necessarily necessary for food in the valley for the tribes. So such as the plants and trees that we normally associate with the forests up in the Cascades, they would not survive. They don't normally survive very well on the valley floor with fire, because they're not as fire resistant as trees like wood, like oak trees and other fire resistant plants in the valley. And oaks produced acorns, which were edible. The other plants in the valley that are highly edible are the bulb producing plants, like camas, that where the camas bulbs would be preserved underground. And there's many other root plants that tribes would dig up and eat, and those would all be preserved with the cool burns that come across the valley every year. And then the other secondary effect to mention is the tribes likely saw that by setting fire to land every year, they eliminated the possibility of catastrophic burns. Because if they didn't, there would have been a massive catastrophic burn. It would have burned everybody out, burned the people. And there are actually oral histories of Native peoples who went through catastrophic burns, and the people had to sort of move somewhere else because the burn was so bad that it burned up it chased all the livestock away, the deer and elk, and it destroyed the woods so badly so that nobody could eat or sustain themselves there. So there are records of that too. So the fire did numerous purposes, and it's what we call stewarding land. If you don't appropriately take care of it with a really efficient technology that, and tribes didn't have, lawnmowers and stuff like that. So if you don't take care of it with efficient process, then it will overgrow and eventually destroy you.
And even though we perhaps don't take cue enough from the historical relationships that tribes and indigenous people have had with fire, a lot of the reasons that fire is used today are similar. Hazard reduction is probably the number one use of fire today, and that would be true across most of Oregon. When fire is intentionally applied, or when it is managed through a natural ignition to have some of those beneficial effects, then that is often really the reason that it's used. But it's also used for conservation of species that were actually supported by those traditional practices. Some of ththose species in the Willamette Valley include Fender's blue butterfly, which is a subspecies of Bois-Duval's blue butterfly, and it utilizes another subspecies of sulfur lupin that's also endangered for its larval host. So, those plants essentially evolved with those historic tribal burning practices, and now they're conserved using that same element today. But I would say there's a lot of differences now in the way that fire is used, in the sense of managing it with equipment, ensuring that fire stays within a really well-identified boundary that has hard lines in place, because there's infrastructure and a lot of values across the valley now that weren't in place historically that must be protected when fire is applied. So where David Douglas, when he first arrived in the Willamette Valley, found a pretty widely burned landscape, that's no longer possible, but small parcels are burned off today. In other parts of the state, fire is used for wildlife habitat and for rangeland improvement as well. So, the benefits are numerous, and they all lend to that same endpoint, which is use of fire to stave off the negative effects that fire can have.
So let's talk more about that. Let's talk about what are the benefits of fire.
The tribes, besides the benefits already mentioned and those that Amanda just mentioned, the tribes knew that fire would renew the landscape, and so that was a process of, philosophically, what they call world renewal. They knew that, like oak trees, if they go through a fire cycle, that they likely produce more acorns, and so that's more food. And it eliminates the pests, and like we said, but what we now call sort of weeds in the valley eliminates those non-fire resistant weeds that would strangle out perhaps the root plants too. So those are some of the benefits. But anthropogenically, what we know is that humans have a huge effect on the landscape. The landscape does affect human culture, but humans, by applying their cultural techniques to the landscape, also have a huge effect on it. And if you're setting fires on a regular basis, every year, every couple of years, for 8,000-9,000 years perhaps in this area, you're going to create changes in the growth patterns of trees, of plants, of animals, of fishes, whatever. And those things that are fire resistant or found a way to survive in a regular fire cycle are going to survive and perhaps thrive, and then perhaps even develop better techniques to survive fires. So some of the trees have very thick bark, and so many people think that is a fire resistant adaptation of the trees. So it's possible that humans, that Native Americans, by setting fires on a regular basis, cause the trees to get thicker and thicker bark so they would survive on a longer basis in their environment. So this is not just conjecture. It's science. It's just the way that Native people thought about things. They noticed that certain animals and plants survived longer periods, and so they noticed that there were benefits to fire, and so they decided to do it on a regular basis to promote more food, to promote more production of plants that they could use for weaving projects, for making technologies like canoes.
Well, that sounds like a lot of benefits, David. Sure. Amanda, from your perspective, tell us about what are the benefits of fire?
Yeah, I think that the benefits oftentimes tie to how frequently an area would have experienced fire. And so places that experience fire frequently, whether that was from these anthropogenic ignitions or it was from lightning strikes, what is sometimes termed a natural ignition, the more frequently that an area would have experienced those ignitions, the more quickly that it can change, and maybe not for the better without fire. Examples would include both the Willamette Valley and the ponderosa pine forests of Central Oregon, where the frequency is high enough that it doesn't take very long for accumulation of material that would otherwise be cleaned up by fire to really start having a negative impact on the forest. And that alone is not a good condition, but then you add to that the potential for fire to come in under adverse conditions. And it's kind of set up in a way that the benefits will quickly turn into not good situations when they're not maintained, I guess. So, you know, we look at places that have less frequent fire, and they don't tend to be in as bad of shape, if you will, because it takes longer for them to need to burn. So examples would be subalpine forests, you know, that may not burn, but every couple hundred years. And those areas are not what we call out of whack because they don't need fire as often. And then the benefits in those places, you know, are different. So habitat is different in places that don't burn as frequently than those where it burns more frequently. And the dependence on fire really changes. So, you know, we also think about species that really need fire specifically as opposed to surrogates. There's been studies done in the Willamette Valley looking at the use of mowing or mastication as a surrogate for fire. And while it helps, it doesn't have as beneficial effect as fire itself. Fire cycles nutrients, it transforms dead vegetation into available material for plants to utilize. It takes away the layer of thatch that allows plants to have access to sunlight. It releases seed beds that are dormant under the surface. All those things don't happen as readily with surrogate activities. And that's very much the same in the ponderosa pine forests, where you can do a lot of work to reduce the fuel profile. But if you don't actually get in there and remove the fuel with fire, then you know you're kind of missing out. So it really comes down to transformation of material as opposed to just removal. And I think we talk a lot about hazardous fuels reduction and the removal of fuels and forestry practices, which are really important. But if they're not coupled with the return of fire itself, then you get into a different kind of disturbance cycle, which is more of a mechanical cycle. And it probably will get to a point with the benefits, but it doesn't quite get all the way there.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is that it's important for land managers to use all the tools in their toolbox. So thinning, mastication, and fire, those are all very important things for managers to utilize. And so David, you talked early on about fire use for thousands of years. And I'm wondering how the landscape has changed.
Yeah, the tribes into the 19th century were using fire landscape, and like you mentioned, David Douglas saw the effects of fire and on the valley floor. He walked through a burnt landscape in the North Valley, and so people were using the fire in the same manner we've been talking about into perhaps the 1830s, 1840s. And at that time, we saw this massive influx of settlers coming into the valley around 1844, which we now call the Oregon Trail. And it was this immigration of American farmers to a place that they heard about that was supposedly an Eden for farming, already pre-cleared, with very few native inhabitants, and it looked like it was the best place in the world to have a farm. And actually it probably at that time was, because the tribes had just gone through this massive disease cycle in around 1830. They had mostly died off in the valley. About 90% of them died off, and so they were struggling to sort of maintain their cultures in the valley. At the same time, we see this influx of settlers coming in, and the tribes did continue to try to practice their culture, but the settlers, these farmers, took up plots of land that were a mile square, pretty big plots, pretty big farms, and they began to put fences on the land and plow the fields and plant crops. And clearly farmers with crops don't want to see fire come across the land because that would destroy all their crops. So into the 1840s, there was a process of suppressing the natives from practicing their fire regime. The natives were at that time already adapting to the new culture. They were learning how to be farmers. They were learning, the new culture coming in, and so they stopped setting fires. And so we see that then a double anthropogenic shift. One is you're taking away the native culture, which had suppressed fire for thousands of years, and you're imposing a new culture, this Euro-American farming culture upon the valley, farming and domestication of animals, because there was quite a few sheep and cattle in the valley too, eventually. And so in that lack of suppression of fire at that point, we didn't really see the huge effects of it for 30 or 40 years when catastrophic burns started to happen. And I think that the Tillamook burn cycle, which happened over a course of maybe 40 years, is a representation of that cycle. It began pretty early, late 19th century, in the Tillamook area in northwestern Oregon, and that's because the Tillamook people were suppressed from setting fires in their area, and those Tillamook burns were catastrophic. It destroyed forests, destroyed wood. It was something that nobody had ever seen before in that manner, and I think that was directly caused by removing the native culture from the land, removing their regular fire cycle, allowing the duff layers, the woody debris layers on the forest floors to build up, and then when you had the right climate, a fire would come through and destroy everything, which it nearly did in some places. And so I think that's what we see for changes. And Native people, even today, are struggling to even get their oral histories and their knowledge heard by scientists. I mean, they know through stories, through family stories and the like, that they had these regimes, that they had the technology already to manage this huge landscape that we live in. Now it's starting to be listened to because we are in a huge fire regime again. But we still see a lot of resistance from scientists that still think that Native peoples didn't really know what they were talking about on the land.
We have so much to learn, and I'm just musing on this idea of moving towards fire, facing fire, and using it versus sort of protecting, suppressing, and avoiding it. And it really seems like today fire's in our face, and now we have a choice. Do we want to face it? Do we want to learn to live with it and learn how to use it to our benefits, or do we want to continue down the path that we've been on of excluding, suppressing, and trying to protect ourselves from fire when we live in a landscape that has been so adapted to it, and not just through the natural ignitions in the landscape, but the people and their interactions with it. And it seems like we're at a kind of another turning point. The Tillamook burns that you just referred to, that was a pivot point, because it was really the first time that fire and the suppression era came together in Oregon. The big burn of 1910 in the Northern Rockies set the stage for a real industrialized fire suppression effort at the national level. But in Oregon, the Tillamook burns were sort of our moment here in that sense. And it seems like we're revisiting that now. We're facing that again today with the Labor Day fires of 2020. And, I'm just really thinking a lot about how we can look at those fires as an opportunity to learn and move forward in a different way, as opposed to doubling down and viewing them as something that we have to protect ourselves from ever more, that perhaps we need to think a little differently about preparing ourselves for these kinds of fires and preventing the negative effects from them by using fire itself.
So you both have talked today that fire is part of our landscape and has a beneficial role. And Amanda, you touched on this a little bit, but where do we go from here, given what seems to be a fire problem in Oregon? You mentioned the Labor Day fires, and across the West for that matter. You talked about developing more of a relationship with fire. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that it's important to see the landscapes of Oregon as dynamic, as being subject to change, that the state that we knew them in yesterday or last year is not necessarily the state that we're going to know them in the future. And I know I've struggled with this a little bit personally. I grew up on the McKenzie River where the Holiday Farm fire just burned. And I've thought about the places that I would take my son to that now I'm going to introduce him to in a changed state. And so I've really had to kind of rethink my relationship to the landscape where I grew up in terms of acknowledging that it's dynamic and it's subject to change. But I also think that, we need to look ahead knowing that change is coming, even more so than we're experiencing right now with warming climate and the buildup of fuels that we know is on the landscape. Those fuels were historically managed with these practices that David's been talking about. And so we can still use those practices today in a different form. As I said, we have water handling equipment and we have different ignition devices and we do different protocols than would have been done historically, but the spirit is the same of using the very same element that is threatening us today to reduce the threat itself.
Yeah, I've thought about this somewhat, and living in the Northwest, I've lived through a decade or more of fire cycles here. I've seen massive burns, and just even this last year with the Santiam fire, I mean, it basically we were worried about having to sort of evacuate Salem at some point, and which seems odd to think about, but we were really worried about that, and I think that what needs to happen is like Amanda said, some sort of a mixture of new technology along with bringing fire back to the landscape as a tool. I think that if we were to reburn a fire scar that just burned in the last year or last 2 years, you would see beneficial effects down the line. And if that happened on a regular basis, that same fire scar, because then you are creating pre-burnt areas that become fire suppression themselves, and with no fuels basically to help a fire along if it's in the right environment. And I think that, and if we begin expanding that, we'll start to see long-term effects of healthier forests, fire barriers around cities and towns, just really long-term effects with less catastrophic burns than we've had before in the last decade and a half. So I think that really needs to be thought about. Clearly needs to be sort of planned out by fire experts, but I think that there's just too much forest. I mean, the odd comments by our last president about raking the leaves is not going to get to the point that we're at where the forests are just too big. There aren't enough people in the West to sort of rake all the leaves or manage the forest in a technological way. We need some other kind of efficient tool to manage these massive forests in the West. Forests that are much bigger than we are.
Well, that sounds like an opportunity for more learning. So maybe I can get both of you back on another podcast to dive a little bit deeper into some of these topics we talked about. In particular, the use of prescribed fire would be fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amanda and David. This has just been so wonderful to talk with both of you. As we start to wrap up here, we have a few questions we'd like to ask each of our guests. Okay, so David, what is your favorite tree?
I have to go with the cedar, the western red cedar. Tribes use that tree pretty efficiently for all manner of purposes, for making canoes, for making plank houses. Every part of the tree is usable for something. You can even eat parts of the inner bark. You can split the branches and stems and weave the parts of the tree. And so Chinook peoples would make, clothing and hats out of it. So every single piece of that tree can be used for something. It's very, pest resistant. It was easy to use, very straight grain. And so it's a regular kind of splitting wood. And so it's got to be the most important tree for all the tribes in this area.
Wonderful. Amanda, what is your favorite tree?
Well, I'd have to say it's a tie between the Oregon white oak and the ponderosa pine, mostly because they both resist fire's negative effects really well. They're very much dependent on it as well. So ponderosa pine reproduce prolifically, and they depend upon fire to whittle down to just a few trees per acre for its own stand replacement needs. And oak is very similar. But I would say even more so, I appreciate the litter that they create, which is an absolute pleasure to burn. Pine needle cast and oak leaf litter, especially when combined, make for a really lovely fire.
That's so wonderful. Thank you. I have another question, and that is, what is the most interesting thing you bring with you in the field, whether in your cruiser vest or field kit? Amanda, why don't you just start us off?
I carry a little bottle of bubbles that you would blow, for your kid or at a party, because when I'm about to light a prescribed burn, I want to know which way the wind is going. And I also can get an idea of how stable the atmosphere is by blowing bubbles and watching them travel and seeing what they do.
David, what about you? What do you like to bring to the field?
I like bringing people with me in the field. People are so removed from the woods nowadays, from the forest, and Native people are in a similar boat where many Native people were removed to reservations and dissociated with their original nutritional landscapes. And so it's always really great to sort of bring people that don't normally go into the forest to either pick huckleberries or just walk trails, or look for culturally modified trees, or some little cultural trip into the woods with elders and other people who from the tribe who are newly experiencing their traditional landscape for the first time, or are just reassociating themselves. It's really an experience to see them sort of brighten up and to really become energized by that connection.
Oh my goodness, I love that. And David, I hope that I get to come out into the field with you someday. Lastly, Amanda and David, what resources would you recommend to our listeners if they're interested in learning more about fire?
Well, I think fire, while we're saying how awesome it is and how great it would be to return it all, it's still a very dangerous thing. So I think that if anybody was really interested in the fire regime, they really need to do a lot of work, read up a lot on, the different ways of using fire, do some studies on this before they attempt anything, including being involved in any projects and stuff, because you don't want to make a mistake and so you burn down a town or anything. So I think that is important to say. I think that as much as possible, people need to be accessing Native oral histories about using fire as well, because we come at using fire from a cultural perspective. We plan to be here forever. We are basically from time immemorial been here, and we don't plan on basically destroying ourselves. So maybe listening to what we have to say about fire, what our elders have to say about fire, would be important for anybody that wants to learn more about this.
That's great. And you mentioned that you have a blog. Would it be okay that I post your blog to the resources page of the In the Woods podcast website?
Yes, I have a blog, like I mentioned, called the Cortex Journal. Absolutely post it. I don't have a ton of fire articles on there, essays, but there is some TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, and other essays about plants in the Willamette Valley and the range around us.
Excellent. Amanda, what about you? What are some of the resources you would recommend?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network. That started up in Northern California, and it's been a slowly growing network of practitioners in Indigenous fire management. Definitely would recommend checking out Fire Learning Network, Fire Adapted Communities. In Oregon specifically, the Oregon State University Extension Fire Programs page, which will be posted, is a great resource, and that'll connect you to other resources as well. Those would be my primary recommendations. Also, the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council has a website that you could look at too.
Well, that concludes this month's episode of In the Woods podcast. I want to thank you all for listening today, and stay tuned for next month's episode on soil.
Thanks so much for listening. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on our website, blogs.oregonstate.edu/inthewoodspodcast. We'd love to hear from you. Visit the Tell Us What You Think tab on our website to leave us a comment, suggest a guest or topic, or ask a question that can be featured in a future episode. And also give us your feedback by filling out our survey. In the Woods is produced by Lauren Grand, Carrie Berger, Jacob Putney, Stephen Fitzgerald, and Jason O'Brien, who are all members of the Oregon State University Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Team. This podcast is made possible by funding from the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Music for In the Woods podcast was composed by Jeffrey Hino, and graphic design was created by Christina Freehoff. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we can't wait to talk to you again next month. Until then, what's in your woods?